Welcome back to the reading of White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. We have been working our way through this book and taking our time because it is a heavy book. If you have been reading along, we are on page 87, still in chapter 3, The Burning Brown to the Ground. It is about the separate but equal ruling and what came as a result of that. When we left off, we were talking about the Black students who were fighting to receive a quality education that were forced to face this economy that was set up to, again, keep them from being educated. Again, we're on page 87, starting at the first full paragraph. White leaders in the South saw no such thing. They saw themselves as defenders of the Constitution and saviors of state rights against a federal leviathan. In their minds, they were patriots, not racists. In this reworking of history, Black parents were to blame for the interruption of their children's education, since Blacks had chosen integration over education. In this reworking of history, Black parents were to blame for the interruption of their children's education, since Blacks had chosen integration over education. It was not necessarily a choice for them to make, but I digress, and had joined, quote, the federal courts and the NAACP as the aggressors. Because the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was supposedly at the epicenter of the tumult and rebellion in the South, the next round in the chamber of massive resistance had the NAACP's name all over it. Wilkins would shudder as he recounted how there was nothing abstract about the South's hatred of the NAACP at that time. Starting in 1956, legislators from Virginia to Texas passed a series of laws that banned the association from operating within the southern states' borders. An especially pernicious law, Broderie, cast the NAACP's formidable legal team as nothing more than ambulance chasers, drumming up business by cajoling both the unwitting and the amoral into a series of dubious lawsuits alleging violations of constitutional rights. Not only did the cynical enforcement of Broderie statutes stop the association from providing legal counsel to those taking the brunt of Jim Crow, but it prevented the NAACP from giving financial support to those suing the state as well, tied their hands at every opportunity. Southern governments also went after the association where it hurt, demanding that the organization either hand over or publicly post its membership lists. Louisiana, in a rather unsavory twist, resurrected an old anti-Klan law and used it against the NAACP, which was now required to file membership lists with the state. That would have meant putting a bullseye on every dues-paying member, inviting, at bare minimum, economic extortion as credit was cut off, mortgages called in, and jobs suddenly withdrawn. Indeed, in 5 states, NAACP members were banned from holding public employment. Moreover, identifying who paid dues to the association meant that NAACP members would also be targeted for violence. Fully comprehending that Black people's lives and livelihoods hung in the balance, the association refused to comply. That noncompliance led to a series of injunctions and fines, some totaling over $100,000, that effectively crippled the NAACP below the Mason-Dixon line. For 8 years, at the peak of the civil rights movement, which had been spurred on by Brown, the association was severely hampered in the South. Not until 1964 could the NAACP resume operations in Alabama. 1 year after Brown 2 in Alabama, I want you to remember that we're gonna come back to that at the end of this reading. 1 year after Brown 2, and the same year that segregationists in Congress issued the Southern Manifesto, Attorney General Eugene Cook of Georgia capriciously decided that the NAACP was, despite its tax-exempt status, a for-profit organization that owed the state $17,000 in back taxes, or for the equivalent in 2014 of $150,000. Cook then insisted, and a local judge concurred, that until the NAACP paid what it supposedly owed Georgia, the association would not be able to operate in the state. Just to drive home the point, authorities arrested the head of the NAACP's branch in Atlanta. Similarly, in 1956, Texas Attorney General John Ben Shepherd instructed armed Texas Rangers and state highway patrolmen to raid local NAACP offices searching for proof of failure to pay taxes and engaging in unlawful political activity. Despite an utter lack of evidence, a local judge issued the requisite injunction to put the NAACP, which refused to turn over its membership list, out of business in Texas. The recalcitrant South swaddled itself in the American flag, portraying its efforts as the last holdout of patriotism. Georgia's Eugene Cook, Mississippi Senator James O. Eastland, and Arkansas Congressman Ezekiel Gathings combined two of their favorite villains, the NAACP and the Communist Party USA, into one treasonous behemoth, which they unveiled during a series of congressional and state hearings. Senator Eastland, for example, ignoring that in his own Mississippi, Amite County, officials spent only $3.51 per Black student while providing $30.24 for every white one, claimed that Brown was the result of communist manipulation. Drawing on questionable records from the infamous House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, the Mississippi senator insisted that the scholars the association had relied on in Brown, such as sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, had no less than 18 citations before HUAC. It is evident, Eastland roared, that the decision of the Supreme Court in the school segregation cases was based upon the writings and teachings of pro-communist agitators and other enemies of the American form of government. Gathings, to give an air of legitimacy to the charges, filled more than 80 pages in the congressional record with assertions that the NAACP's effort to destroy Jim Crow was actually an anti-white plot hatched in Moscow. The creativity. Cook similarly sounded the alarm that the NAACP sees the racial issue as a convenient front for their more nefarious activities, including delivering this nation into the hands of international communism. Sensitivity to such arguments, no matter how specious, only increased when a Cold War crisis hit in 1957. On Friday, October 4th of that year, America's sense of nuclear invincibility was shattered by the faint beep, beep, beep sound heard over a radio receiver. The Soviets had successfully launched a satellite, Sputnik, that circled Earth every 96 minutes. Until then, the threat of the Kremlin's nuclear arsenal had been mitigated by the USSR's seemingly inability to send a payload of destruction across the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans. Suddenly, though, with that ominous beeping, traveling thousands of miles had been reduced to the equivalent of crossing the street. The new republic feared that Sputnik was proof of the fact that the Soviet Union has gained a commanding lead in certain vital sectors of the race for world scientific and technological supremacy. The New York Times glumly reported that the Department of Defense's missile experts were shaken by Sputnik because it was evidence of Soviet superiority in rocketry. The Washington Post intoned, "This is confirmation, if any really is needed, of Soviet progress with the intercontinental ballistic missile and intermediate range ballistic missile." The grave consequences were not just military, however. They also threatened the entire structure of the U.S. Cold War foreign policy. Quote, "Let no one mistake the political significance of the Soviet accomplishment," continued the Post's gloomy editorial. "It will have a strong psychological effect in intimidating wavering allies in uncommitted countries, for it will seem to say that the Soviet Union is irresistible." End quote. This was a national security crisis. President Eisenhower had earlier commissioned a blue ribbon panel led by the head of the Ford Foundation, H. Rowan Gaither, to prepare an analysis for the National Security Council on the state of America's military preparedness. Sputnik had launched right before the final report hit the president's desk. The reaction to the report was as thunderous as that to the Soviet satellite itself. The top-secret Gaither report detailed America's shocking descent into a second-class power in the face of rocketing Soviet military might, and portrayed a United States in the gravest danger in its history. Even Eisenhower, who had received enormous criticism for his apparent complacency, had to shake off the charge-peppering newspaper op-eds that the White House was the tomb of the well-known soldier, and admit that if things didn't change soon, the United States would not be able to recover. In some measure of silver lining, the Sputnik debacle, many agreed, could be traced right back to the schoolhouse door. There was a general consensus that this Cold War defeat was a direct result of something the nation's educational institutions did or did not do. Some pointed to the trend toward progressive education and the lack of attention to the basics, especially math and science. Most had identified the source of the problem, however, as the unconscionable waste of intellectual talent as poor and unmotivated youth failed to go on to college. Changing his tune, Eisenhower now asserted that the United States had to do everything it could to prevent the loss of a student with real ability. He stressed that it was vital that this generation of American youth get the education necessary to be equipped to live in the age of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Delay or failure to act, Eisenhower insisted, would leave the United States irretrievably behind. So now education is okay because we need people to go to war for the country. Okay. In fact, the president's politicians, educators, and pundits all hammered on this imperative against waste, arguing that the hundreds of thousands of students who did not go on to college were being lost to the nation. Alabama Congressman Carl Elliott, who would take the lead in this crusade to transform education in the United States by backing the National Defense Education Act, argued that, quote, in the context of critical national needs, a valuable national resource must not be lost through lack of action. And he warned, whatever happens in America's classrooms during the next 50 years will eventually happen to America. What was happening to millions of students in America's classrooms in 1957, as Eliot well knew, was a direct outcome of Jim Crow. The long shadow it cast on a nation struggling to produce enough scientists and engineers should have signaled a turning point in the war over Brown. An acknowledgement that schools with no libraries and no labs had no chance of training the next generation of inventors and theoreticians. I probably said that wrong. Grappling with America's trenchant refusal to open up the doors to quality education, Time announced that the, quote, gap between what the Negro now achieves and what he might achieve indicates that he is the nation's most wasted resource. The gap between what the Negro now achieves and what he might achieve indicates that he is the nation's most wasted resource. Yeah, a resource, not a person, a resource. For all of his hand wringing, Representative Elliott had no intention of doing anything to repair the structural threat to national security posed by a system that deliberately starved millions of its citizens of adequate education. While he was clear that, after Sputnik, the nation had to mobilize its brain power, including school children and undergraduate and graduate students, on an emergency basis, he was equally resolute in his conviction that maintaining racial segregation and the built-in inequality that came with it was more critical to the nation. I will say this forever, that white supremacy makes no sense. It makes no sense because it has no sense behind it. There's no common sense to it. So in the very same breath, the page before this, they can acknowledge that the Negro, that the Black person, is the most wasted resource, not a person, a wasted resource. But then directly behind it, we need to maintain racial segregation because it's critical to the nation. Thus, why bills for the National Defense Education Act bounced through Congress, seeking ways to provide unprecedented federal financial support to schools and universities. Elliott, along with his fellow Alabamian Senator Lister Hill, both of whom had signed the Southern Manifesto, were insistent that any movement on education funding, even if for national security, could not in any way dismantle Jim Crow or penalize Southern schools and universities for refusing to integrate. The Alabamians had a strong ally in Eisenhower. Even before Brown, he had voiced great skepticism about the validity of integration that did not spring organically from, say, Mississippi or South Carolina. He was a states' rights man. Therefore, in his eyes, the Supreme Court was wrong to insert the federal government into local race relations. In 1953, he complained that, quote, 2 or 3 court decisions of recent years have tended to becloud the original decision of equal but separate facilities, end quote. He was especially piqued at the McLaurin decision, which ruled that, quote, a Negro in graduate school attending exactly the same classes as whites, but separated from them by some kind of railing was, the victim of discrimination. That just seemed preposterous. After the Brown decision, and despite the rumblings in the South about a declaration of war, the president still wanted implementation to accord a maximum of initiative to local courts. The Southern Manifesto, the outlawing of the NAACP, and the murder of Emmett Till led Eisenhower to 1957 to write to his best friend, Edward Swede Hazlitt, that no other single event has so disturbed the domestic scene in many years as did the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 in the school segregation case. To find some manner of peace, the president laid out his priorities: empathy for how hard it would be for the South to jettison its way of life on the basis of a, quote, mere decision of the Supreme Court, especially after building and maintaining a legally segregated society for more than 60 years, and respect for the Supreme Court's authority. The president hoped to reconcile the two. Quote, the plan of the Supreme Court to accomplish integration gradually and sensibly, he conveyed to Hazlitt, seems to me to provide the only possible answer if we are to consider, on the one hand, the customs and fears of a great section of our population, and on the other hand, the binding effect that Supreme Court decisions must have on all of us if our form of government is to survive and prosper, end quote. Noticeably absent from the president's list of priorities were the rights and educational needs of African Americans. Thus, as the National Defense Education Act was being debated and crafted, Eisenhower had no intention of using tens of millions of federal dollars to finally gain compliance with Brown by, quote, threatening to withhold funds from segregated educational institutions, end quote. Wilkins, who later assessed Eisenhower's leadership in the face of massive resistance, could say only that at virtually every turn, quote, the president had left us all out in the cold. The White House's icy stance was affirmed by the attorney for the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, Richard Conley, who explained during the House Senate conference proceedings on the proposed National Defense Education Act that although Brown was a law of the land, his agency had no intention of enforcing that ruling. Integration, he assured Representative Elliott, would not be a precondition for obtaining funds unless the Southern-dominated Congress decided it should be, which was highly unlikely. In addition, when selecting universities to house the federally sponsored language training centers, the lawyer continued, the overall quality of the school would determine choices rather than the segregation practices of the institution, which would not be a controlling factor. Similarly, Conley explained to Congress, HEW would have no problem providing fellowships and student loan funds to institutions that, quote, still practiced segregation, so long as those awards to students were, quote, made without discrimination. They would have no problem providing fellowships and student loans to institutions that still practice segregation, but as long as the awards were made without discrimination. So we're not going to discriminate against the white students, but we're going to make sure the Black students. Thus, the University of Georgia, Ole Miss, and the University of Alabama, among other universities in the South, could continue to deny African Americans admission on the basis of race as long as fellowships went to any of the enrolled white students on a non-racially discriminatory basis. Nothing about that sentence makes sense. Assured that Brown would have no effect on the proposed National Defense Education Act, Elliott and Hill, desperate to pour federal dollars into the white schools in Alabama, marshaled all their legislative wizardry to guide the bill through both houses of Congress and dodged the amendment from Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr., a Democrat from New York, that restricted federal funding to only those institutions in full compliance with the Supreme Court decision. And so, when House Resolution 13247 successfully emerged, allocating $183 million in 1959 and another $222 million in 1960 to schools and universities for fellowships, facility upgrades, and state-of-the-art equipment, the desperate conditions that faced African American students remained in full force. Given Congressman Elliott's prediction that whatever happened in America's classrooms in the 1950s would determine what the United States would look like half a century later, the deliberate omission of African Americans from the National Defense Education Act bore its bitter fruit. In 2004, 50 years after Brown, quote, not a single African American earned a PhD in astronomy or astrophysics, end quote, according to the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. In fact, of the 2,100 PhDs awarded in 43 different fields in the natural sciences, not one of those doctoral degrees went to an African American. The refusal to implement Brown throughout the South, even in the face of Sputnik, not only as a law or as simple humanity might have dictated, but also as demanded by national interest and patriotism, compromised and underscored American strength. Now, in the 21st century, the sector of the U.S. economy that accounts for more than 50% of our sustained economic expansion, science and engineering, is relying on an ever-dwindling, skilled and educated workforce. Whereas at one point, quote, about 40% of the world's scientists and engineers resided in the U.S., end quote, according to Rodney C. Adkins, senior vice president of IBM, that number had shrunk to about 15% by 2012. The 1950s then should be seen as a fateful moment in America when history failed to turn and alter the trajectory of the nation. Brown held out hope to millions desperately seeking good quality education. Children clamored to go to school, fought for it even. A teenage Barbara Johns, for example, rallied her classmates in 1951 to take a stand against the horrible conditions at Moton High in Prince Edward County. Yet, for fighting to be educated, she had to be spirited out of the state for her parents to go live with her uncle, the Reverend Vernon Johns, in Alabama. Black adults, too, put their lives on the line for the children. Reverend Joseph Delane, who sued Clarendon County, South Carolina for gross unequal education and became one of the cases bundled in Brown, faced the unbridled wrath of local whites. Quote, they fired him, they fired his wife, and two of his sisters and a niece. And they sued him on trumped-up charges and convicted him in a kangaroo court and left him with a judgment that denied him credit from any bank. And they burned his house to the ground while the fire department stood around watching the flames consume the night, end quote. Since the days of enslavement, African Americans have fought to gain access to quality education. Education can be transformative. It reshapes the health outcomes of a people. It breaks the cycle of poverty. It improves housing conditions. It raises the standard of living. Perhaps most meaningfully, educational attainment significantly increases voter participation. In short, education strengthens a democracy. In short, education strengthens a democracy. As if sensing this threat, white opposition careened from the massive resistance of disenfranchisement, interposition, school closures, and harassment of the NAACP to the passive resistance of pupil placement laws, residential segregation, token integration, and, quote, neighborhood schools. In Little Rock, when the schools were forced to reopen, the most liberal member of the school board, sounding eerily similar to Georgia Attorney General Eugene Cook, proposed using the law to undercut Brown and limit how integrated Little Rock schools would be. He argued that pupil assignment plans, using the same factors that Mississippi had considered, quote, ability, whether a good fit or not, could ensure that most African Americans stayed right where they were in their well-segregated neighborhoods. Meanwhile, a handful of blacks could be enrolled in white schools, just enough, he explained, to satisfy the federal courts, but at the same time small enough to satisfy the reluctant and vocal whites in the community. This tactical shift from stall and defy to stall and undermine effectively clogged court dockets for more than 40 years, as African Americans struggled to nail down a moving target whose goal had not changed: stop black advancement. African Americans weren't the only ones who took a hit. The states of the Deep South, which fought Brown tooth and nail, today all fall in the bottom quartile of state rankings for educational attainment, per capita income, and quality of health. Prince Edward County, in particularly, bears the scars of a place that saw fit to fight the Civil War right into the middle of the 20th century. Certainly, it is no accident that in 2013, despite a knowledge-based, technology-driven global economy, the number one occupation in the county seat of Farmville was cook and food preparation worker. Nor is it any accident that in 2013, while 9.9% of white households in the county made less than $10,000 in annual income, fully 32.9% of black households fell below that threshold. The insistence on destroying Brown, and thus the viability of America's schools and the quality of education children receive regardless of where they live has resulted in the economic equivalent of a permanent national recession for wide swaths of the American public. That's the end of chapter 3. A lot of gems popped out from that one. I mentioned Alabama because talking again, one of the things we discussed is how history is continuing itself. And yesterday, the news broke that the co-captain from the Montgomery, Alabama brawl, was charged with third-degree assault for defending himself. And I wanted to bring that up because we saw the results of Black students and Black people trying to defend themselves or trying to defend their right to education, and how they were painted as the aggressors, how their support systems, the NAACP, was painted as the aggressors. And since they were painted as the aggressors, then they were able to be treated as such, as though they were the violent ones. The same thing with these students, these schools doing the bare minimum to say that they are following the rules, but just enough to placate and make sure that the white citizens of the county and the states are happy. All of this while acknowledging the importance and the value that Black people have, while still calling them resources and not actually people, and all the while doing everything they can to keep education from Black students and Black people, everything in their power. And we've talked before about how white supremacy, when left to its own devices, will loop itself back around. White supremacy affects everybody. It does not help anybody. It affects everybody. Everybody is affected by white supremacy, which is why everybody is capable of upholding white supremacy. And we see this right here. The way that Alabama looks today, with employment, with income that housing has, with the state in general, it is all a direct result of keeping education from students, because keeping education from Black students meant altering the education that white students received. They talked about how education is the biggest tool to democracy. How often do we see the schools now trying to rewrite history, trying to remove books with accurate history, trying to limit the accessibility that students have to learn actual history? We see it now with so many politicians and so many people that are in power that are so threatened by apps that are on social media, because information is moving so quickly and people are able to see what's actually going on and not just what's being presented to us. Everything is repeating itself. And it all comes down to the fact that education is what is key. When I say education, that does not always mean the traditional education, although we are talking about this here. But it does mean that you keep your mind sharp, you keep your mind cute, you stay curious, you question things. You question things, just like some of the Black people in chapter 3 in the NAACP, they were questioning how the desegregation was actually happening. They were questioning why things were done. You have to question things. If you question nothing, everything will stay the same. Everything stays the same. Question what you've been taught. Because if what you've been taught and what you know is so good for everybody around us, why are we still having this conversation? Why is there still so much racial violence? Be curious. Question things. We will pick up next week, moving into chapter 4. Your journal prompts for this week. I want you to think about the ways in which we're going to keep talking about the ways that history is repeating itself. A continuation of itself. And I want you to look at specific ways that you have seen, whether in your life directly or in line or online or in the news, where the person, a marginalized person, has been painted as the aggressor, as a way to justify violence or oppression against that person, or as a way to place the blame of that oppression at the feet of the person that is being oppressed. What you will notice with a lot of these journal prompts is thinking beyond yourself and making you curious, having you be curious and stretch your mind a little bit. Ask these questions. What's the same? What could be different? Why isn't it different? Remembering that we can't go back and change anything, but we can certainly make some steps to change what comes up. Thank you for reading this. As a reminder, make sure that you're staying hydrated, especially with everything else that's going on in the world. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself. And I will see you all next week.